Keldon, the floor is yours. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Perfect. As Shivali said, but I'll repeat it. Jennifer's done a great job teeing up the bigger conversation, and Shivali going deeper on this, very interesting element. And I think I'm going to pick up that third piece that Jennifer spoke to, and go a little bit deeper on it. So as you said, I'm a co-founder of the Canadian Anti-Monopoly Project, and I want to talk about, monopoly in Canada's food system, and with a focus on, where my expertise lies, which is in the sort of competition and antitrust element of it. Next slide, please. So who and or what is the Canadian Anti-Monopoly Project? And this is a bit specious given the hard work that everybody's doing on monopoly issues, but we do think CAMP is Canada's first anti-monopoly focused think tank and advocacy organization. We're very fresh. We sort of we're very much in bootstrap mode, and came together at the end of the summer with my co-founders Robin Shaban and Andrew Cameron, and our goal is to advocate for stronger competition laws, yes, narrowly, but also economic policies that support, again, that free, fair, and democratic economy. We think something very important: make sure that distributed range of actors have a say and feel like that they can control their economic destiny. My disclaimer here is that I am a competition policy nerd, and I'm here to learn a lot more about the food system as something that we think really needs to be part of the competition conversation. Want to give a shout out to a colleague who I believe is in the audience, Andrew Nixon, PhD student out of Guelph. He and I have done some work together. He's really brought me up to speed on the agricultural and food system side of the house. Next slide, please. So I want to open with a bit of a pitch that anti-monopoly, and again, I think what people know in this room, has always been a part of Canada's food system. As Jennifer discussed, there has been a retreat, I think, in the past 40 or 50 years. But although, using different language than the US counterparts, which I think is much more sharply focused on monopoly and corporate power, I think the history of Canada's food system is absolutely full of examples of, different levers being used against concentrated economic power, from cooperatives and the pools, to the Ontario United Farmers of Ontario, and the Canadian Wheat Board. There's a really rich history, big and small, both public and private, of levers against concentrated economic power in our food system. Next slide, please. I won't spend too much time on this slide because Jennifer did such a great job of teeing up the current state. But from that history, we are at a real moment of intense corporate concentration. I've got a couple of numbers here, which are called concentration ratios, and CR4. What is the market share? These are from 2021. They may be a bit out of date. What's the market share of the top 4 firms or the top 2 firms? We've talked about JBS and Cargill as two pretty extreme examples of beef processing in Canada. But on the flip side, we do actually have, I think we are in the middle of a growing conversation on concentration and corporate power in Canada. Now, the caveat there is that the conversation to date really has been, I think, limited to the retail sector, which I think in a lot of ways makes sense. That's where the most Canadians actually interact with the food system. But in reality, as folks are now very familiar, and I think we're probably familiar before, many layers of the food system are highly concentrated domestically as well as internationally, especially at that input level. So clearly there's, from this history, both in Canada and internationally, we've drifted, and we now find ourselves in a moment of quite intense concentration. And I think as inflation has really affected Canadians' lives over the past years, the invisible concentration is really coming to the fore. So it is a shame that has to occur only in the times of economic distress, but I think that is opening people's eyes to something that was very much hidden in the background before. Next slide, please. So how did we get here? And my caveat again is I really am focusing on that third element that Jennifer mentioned, which is this, a weak approach to corporate concentration and our competition or antitrust laws. So, dipping back to the states for a little bit, there is a narrative right now that there was a golden era of antitrust that reigned kind of from the post-war era until the 70s and the 80s. That's as Jennifer showed, the Robert Bork, the Chicago School. And I think it's tempting to say Canada has gone through the same process. We had our Modern Competition Act came out in 1986. As I'll discuss, it's very efficiency focused. But in reality, I think the story is a bit more downbeat. Canada never really took corporate concentration or concentrated economic power particularly seriously in terms of its antitrust laws in that lens. And the efficiency mindset over the past 40 or 50 years really is just an extension of not taking that role seriously. So I give one example, which is there was a guide put out for the 1986 Competition Act, and they said there's never been a successful merger blocked in court in the almost 100 years that these laws have existed, well, 75 at the time. And since then, since 1986, the Competition Bureau has really only successfully blocked one merger. And I use the term blocked loosely because it wasn't the full block of a merger. It was actually a divestiture of part of the merger while the transaction was allowed to proceed. And stepping out of the food system, I think the ongoing Rogers Shaw merger, which is, I've got a second screen over here with the hearing live on another Zoom because I really do have a problem, is emblematic of this really weak treatment of corporate concentration and mergers, a prime avenue to increasing concentration. We have a market with extremely high barriers to entry. We know we get a pretty raw deal compared to international counterparts, and yet a merger where an entrenched incumbent is purchasing a disruptive competitor, and it's not only on the table, but it's most likely to succeed with a complicated remedy. And just to throw a couple of numbers out there, in the past 6 years in Canada, for which there's public data available, there's been about 16,000 mergers. The Competition Bureau, which is our competition authority, has reviewed, which has done any amount of analysis on about 8%, and they've really only intervened in 0.2%. So when we talk about enforcement or over enforcement, we really are talking about a vanishingly small number of transactions that actually are the subject of any real scrutiny and then intervention. But what those numbers, I think, hide or don't speak to is that in that 0.2% that we intervene, we really don't do a good job of addressing the competition issues that are identified. So, and I wish in retrospect, I should have put this on a slide, but I think there's three big problems with Canada's approach to mergers and corporate concentration in general. First is that the funnel for mergers that we analyze is too narrow. That's that 8%. We really only look at a small slice. Second, the bar for the Bureau to intervene is extremely high, especially in fast-moving and innovative markets. And I have a paper out with CIGI or CIGI to that effect. And then third, and I think that's reflected in the 0.2% where we actually intervene. And then third, the solutions we use, rather than just blocking harmful mergers, we engage in these sort of complex and I think quite fanciful solutions where we try to create new competitors or get competitors to agree to terms that we believe address the competition issues while still allowing the merger to go through. And I think more often than not, that really isn't a successful path. Next slide, please. Sorry, can I get the next slide? Oh, perfect, thanks. So more positive story. Where do we go from here? Well, I do believe, and again, this is narrowly in the sort of competition angle. Canada can have a competition law that stops further concentration, that protects unfair competition, protects against unfair competition, and promotes fair competition across markets. And in fact, last week, the federal government opened a consultation on Canada's Competition Act running until the end of February, which is really the first opportunity for the public, since really 1986, although there was a brief, narrow kind of closed door consultation in 2008, to make the voices heard that I think really are affected by this kind of corporate concentration, as opposed to the legal and financial interests that would like our laws to remain lax. And so on the positive side, I think the government is at least open to hearing from a broader range of voices, and it's incumbent on us to take advantage of that opportunity. Next slide, please. And, we really are in the midst of a growing global anti-monopoly movement. Here's just a real small grouping of organizations in the States and abroad, particularly the EU, that are really moving the needle on the anti-monopoly conversation globally. And as as has been hinted at by the nature of some of these firms, it really is a global movement that is required. Canada can't go on its own, but even, countries like the US and Europe, there needs to be coordination if we are going to, meaningfully change the trajectory for some of these, global input firms. And CAMP really does stand on the shoulders of these organizations and the great work that they've been doing. Next slide, please. So at the conceptual and intellectual level, today, and we heard a little bit about this before, but our competition law in general is very focused on a narrow view of economic efficiency. And that leads to this, very hived off definition of, what is anti-competitive, what justifies government intervention. And in the US, we talk about the consumer welfare standard. Well, in Canada, we don't even have the consumer welfare standard, and we are often ready to accept higher prices at the cost of Canadians and even competition itself, the process, in exchange for these narrow efficiency gains. And so the work to be done is to show both individuals and policymakers the value of, concepts that I call, fair competition, as opposed to this narrow view of efficiency that leads to further and further concentration and really worse outcomes for everyone involved. And this fair competition conversation, which I'd be happy to elaborate on, is kind of one step on the path towards, I think, what ultimately needs to be a deconcentration agenda. But there is a recognition that the political economy in Canada, let alone in the US, which is much further along here, there's a long way to go before we can have that conversation. And I think the first place is moving away from this efficiency mindset and incorporating elements of fairness into our competition law. Next slide, please. But I do want to make clear that obviously competition law, what we focus on in general, is just one avenue of this effort to address corporate concentration. And so, examples domestically and abroad: Canadian Grain Commission; in the UK, the Grocery Supply Code of Practice, which balances the relationship between suppliers and major grocers; and the newly about to be enacted Digital Markets Act, which again balances power and tries to reestablish fairness between major digital platforms and gatekeepers, and both the consumers but in particular the businesses that depend on them. And each of these things have a view towards competition, but they exist outside of the competition law, narrowly defined, often referred to as antitrust, of each of these jurisdictions. So although my presentation and my spiel really is focused on our opportunity around the Competition Act, I want to make sure we don't have, I'm mostly speaking to myself right now, that we don't have blinders on when we think about the broader universe where competition law and regulation go hand in hand to, I think, support fair competition and combat the consequences of concentrated economic power. Next slide, please. And I would love, and I believe that that today's audience should be a part of this effort. As I mentioned with the launch of the consultation on the Competition Act until the end of February, everybody here has an opportunity to direct the future of Canada's competition law. And if we sit this out, we really do make room for the interests of concentrated economic power and the legal and financial interests to dominate the conversation and not only not move forward, but actually move backward. But I want to be clear, as the government has taken a strong step in opening this consultation, but it is still a very dense and expert-focused conversation. I was talking with an advocacy friend of mine last night, and he was reading the consultation paper. He said, I don't understand this at all. And I said, of course, like it's written for such an expert audience, which is, I think, a failing, but still an opportunity. So CAMP has that competition expertise. That's what we bring to the table. But we need voices and expertise in this room and from the food system in particular to bring that lens and translate the costs of monopoly, the consequences of concentrated economic power, and we can take that and turn that into the language that policymakers speak in this very sort of often esoteric seeming area. So anyone today, individuals or organizations, if you're interested in either learning more about the Competition Act, participating in the consultation, or partnering with CAMP in any way, I would highly recommend reach out to me directly. I've got my email there. We've got a contact form on our website, or follow me on Twitter and shoot me a DM. I'm not particularly choosy, but over the next 3 months, we really do have an opportunity, I think, to end on a positive note, to push the government to update a body of law that for the past almost 40 years really hasn't been serving Canadians, but I think really could. Next slide. And all I want to say is thanks so much for giving me your time.
Thank you so much, Keldon. I hadn't actually heard much the highlighting of this word antitrust that a lot of you had brought up, but I'm so glad to see that it's come to more the forefront of the conversation, and I think we need to kind of elaborate on this all. I attended a social license and public trust summit that was mostly food industry leaders in Ottawa in 2016, and this was facilitated by the Saskatchewan government and took place in several places across Canada. I was there with Lucy Sherratt from the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network, one of our other allies, and we really didn't know how to answer the question because this was such a new concept of social trust, of social license and public trust, that how to challenge this without seeming so fringe and kind of like introducing these concepts that maybe weren't very familiar to people. So I'm really glad to see this conversation continuing, and thank you all so much for this.